Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about input. And in particular, we're talking about input and how this is going to set us up to be able to teach grammar using the structured input method. So this is an extremely basic introduction to some of the mountain of research that is out there about input and processing theories and everything like that. So I'm not going to pretend even the slightest amount that some of the awesome researchers we're going to talk about today have discovered. But what I want to do is I want to kind of digest what I've been able to understand and help you to kind of get a framework to be able to use what we're going to talk about in your classes. Okay. So let's start out with a really brief overview of what we've discovered so far in second language acquisition and how that is going to affect it. Okay, so SLA is for second language acquisition. And the first thing is extremely important. Second language acquisition is a very slow process. So we've learned over time that by the end of year one, learners are not fluent. And it's not anything we're doing. It's just the way that this works, right? They say that there's a certain number of hours that you become, quote, fluent, whether or not that's the word or not, it takes forever. If you think of first language acquisition, when a baby first starts talking, they're not fluent by the time that they're born just because they're born into that language. Okay? So second language acquisition models that in terms of how long it takes to get there, right? So it takes that time for learners to acquire. We're going to talk about the different, it's acquiring language and knowing about language. Knowing about language is just knowing rules and everything like that. Acquiring it is kind of having this internal mental representation of it, right? So this third point is probably one of the most important points as well with this, and this is kind of going to be our driving force behind what we talk about today, is that interaction with input is how learners acquire language. So think about it. If I told you right now to go ahead and learn Japanese, okay? Your goal is to learn Japanese as best as you can, but you're not allowed to read anything in Japanese, and you're not allowed to listen to anything in Japanese. All you can do is speak and write it. Well, that's just not possible, right? Because you've never seen what it looks like per se, and you don't know what it sounds like. So how on earth are you going to be able to write, or are you going to be able to speak it, right? So learners need to have some sort of interaction with input, and that's how they're going to acquire language. That's why we choose authentic texts, or that's why we teach or write our own text, so that learners have comprehensible input, so that they're able to process what they read or process what they hear, and that's going to help them acquire some language so that it builds up in their head, and then eventually it can come out as output. And so, like I was saying, learners are going to build what's called an internal system or a mental representation in their heads, and that's what they're going to use to kind of process the language. So we give them all this input so that they're able to build a lot of different forms, right? They can form patterns in their head, they can acquire different things, and then that's going to help them to be able to speak or write. So what's interesting is that for world language education is so different than other subject areas because everybody's at a different spot. The way that everybody kind of interprets the language and the way that that mental representation builds up in your head is so different for every single learner in your room. And that's what makes our jobs, in my opinion, more fun, but also much more difficult. Okay? So there's a lot more with second language acquisition, obviously, but these are the 4 points that I'm just going to talk about today. So I'm using this word input, and it's probably a good idea for me to talk about what actually input is. And in a really basic sense, input is language that is heard, seen, or viewed. So that's what thinking of the interpretive mode, right? So things that you're listening to, things that you're reading, things that you're viewing, if it's like sign language. So in terms of that, input is really important because, like I said, that's how they're going to build that representation in their heads, right? That mental representation. So that's why we're going to use text at their level so that they can acquire the language. They can start to build those things up. Okay? So it's never just enough, and a lot of people kind of fall into this trap at first where they say, well, I'm just going to speak 100% in the language. They'll sit there, they'll listen, it'll be great, but they're not attending to the input at that point, right? You might have one or two kids that really want to listen, but you need to have them doing something with input so that they're working with it, so that they're what we call attending to it. Okay? The more that they work with that input, the more they're going to be able to acquire, hopefully, right? So then we have input, and then we have output. Output is the end goal of it, right? Output is being able to produce language, okay? So when they're novices, honestly, the input that they give is so important for them to be able to produce output. At first, it's kind of more explicit in terms of like it's memorized chunks of language and words. But when you get into that intermediate and advanced level and they're really creating and describing and doing all these great things when they're outputting language, it's because of that mental representation that was built up because of the input. So let's talk about this real quick. So in terms of the way things have been done for so long, this is kind of the traditional grammar practice that we've seen, right? So a lot of the times what we would do at first is we would provide students with some sort of input, right? Whether they're listening to something or whether they're reading something or whatever, and they're just getting input. And then there's this big part right here called the developing system. So while they're doing the listening or the reading, they're thinking about what they heard or read. And this is where you start to get what's called intake as well. Intake is what actually sticks in the brain. Just because you give them input doesn't mean it always sticks. So here, students can stay here for a really, really long time while they're thinking about what they heard or thinking about what they read. And then eventually we get them to the output because they're going to, quote, practice with the language. Okay? So we think that it goes like this. So what I'm asking us to kind of think about, and what Bill Van Patten from Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen and all of his different publications has talked about, is to rethink about the way we approach grammar. Okay? So look, we have the same 3 steps, but in red we have different steps here. Okay? So in the input, we're still going to give them that input. But what's really different is here in the developing system. So before, what we were asking them to do is just, all right, I just want you to think about it. Here what we're doing is I actually want you to do something during this stage to kind of manipulate it. Okay? And then we're going to give you that targeted structure I want you to produce. So the difference is, beforehand, we were just kind of letting our kids go and saying, all right, figure it out, like let it build up in your head, it'll get there. But now what this sort of theory is saying is that why don't we work really, really hard while they're in this part, in the developing system, to kind of help them along the way. So kind of bring their attention to certain things, bring their attention to the structures, okay? So what we're going to look at in the next video is structured input, which is a really, really great way of doing that so that we're helping them during this stage to be able to attend to the input in order for them to be able to output it better. Okay. And this kind of goes along the lines of the idea of meaning before form. So if we think of those actual core practices, teaching grammar as a concept, using it in context, but in the bottom, teaching it as a concept, and students are focusing on meaning before they're focusing on the form. Okay. So at that point, learners should always be thinking about what a word means before you think about how to form that word. Okay? That's what we mean by mental representation, by knowing that, for example, in English, when we put ed at the end of a word, that we know that that means past, right? The meaning of that ed is past. The formation of it comes later, okay? So if we think of Spanish, let's say preterite, right? If they get that mental representation of E with an accent mark or I with an accent mark indicates that it's a past event, that's going to build up first. And then we can build that part where we say, by the way, this is how it's formed. Okay. So there's a couple of things to keep in mind, a couple of ideas that we want to keep in mind, some principles. Okay. There's a thing called the first noun principle. So that's where learners are just going to focus on the first noun in the sentence and process that as the subject. This is really important when we're writing things. So for example, if we are trying to teach the passive, right, we're trying to say that something was done, right? So if I was to say the sentence, the cat was chased by the dog, well, so the cat was chased by the dog. Who's actually doing the chasing is actually the dog. But learners are going to think that the cat is actually the subject of the sentence because it comes first. It's kind of this like thing we have to fight in our brains. Another thing is called the lexical preference principle. So this is where learners focus on meaning-making words in the sentence. So this is kind of like, if I want them to focus on past things, like say, like I want them to notice it happened in the past, but every time I put the word yesterday in front of it, they're going to attend to the word yesterday because they know that means past, which means that they're never going to get to the point of understanding that ed means past, or that E with an accent or I with an accent means past. Okay? So we have to kind of keep these two things in mind as we write our activities. If you are super interested in these things, just like I am, these are 3 books that I strongly recommend. We'll talk again more about structured input in the next video. Making Communicative Language Teaching Happen is a fantastic book, and Input Processing and Grammar Instruction. These are 3 really, really good texts to kind of give you more information than what I've given you right now. Okay? So in the next video, like I said, we'll talk about what this looks like in the classroom.